You remember that one time Henry Ford tried to create a rubber-producing utopian community in the middle of the Amazon, but it didn't quite work out? Today we'll be talking about Fordlandia. But before we get there, after all, it is Thanksgiving, so I wanted to take a second to think about a weird Thanksgiving tradition here in America, which is the Macy's Day Parade. And of course, the centerpiece of this holiday tradition are the rubber balloons, which Macy's first rolled out back in 1927 with Felix the Cat. Coincidentally, 1927 was the exact same year that Henry Ford had brokered a deal with the Brazilian government to get his hands on a section of Amazonian rainforest a little bit smaller than the state of Connecticut in order to create a massive rubber plantation. 1927 marked the end of a really long quest for Ford. Ford needed lots of rubber, and he had been looking and looking for a cheap source of rubber for the tires, the hoses, the gaskets in his cars. Aside from being a notorious anti-Semite, Ford was very, very obsessed with efficiency, and he wanted to do everything he could to make his factories work better and produce cars more cheaply. But in this regard, rubber presented a special problem. See, at the time, rubber was solely a natural product. Latex came from rubber trees that grew in jungles in Southeast Asia, in the Congo, in Central Africa, and in South America. And other companies had monopolies on rubber production. To make matters even worse, the labor conditions associated with rubber production wherever it was produced were absolutely horrible. Slave labor-like conditions, indentured servitude abounded all over the world, in the Congo, Southeast Asia, including in Latin America, where indigenous workers in particular were sent out into the jungle to collect rubber, basically at gunpoint. In this regard, Ford said, I'm gonna do it differently. I'm going to produce rubber efficiently and in humane conditions, and I'm gonna create housing. He came up with a form of welfare capitalism, and he wanted to transplant this form of welfare capitalism, including company housing, food, sanitary working conditions that he had created in places like Dearborn, Michigan, and transplant it out into the middle of the Amazonian jungle, which the Brazilian government helped facilitate by granting him land. So began the project of Fordlandia in 1928. So with his grant of 2.5 million acres on the Tapajos River, Ford got to work. They built basically an American suburb in the middle of the Pará state out in the Amazonian rainforest. But almost as soon as it started in the 1920s, things started to not go well. Now, Ford never actually set foot in his city, but his fingerprints, his ideas about how it should be run were all over the place. And this is part of the problem with what didn't work out in Fordlandia. For one thing, he told them what to eat and drink. He tried to make all of his workers eat brown rice. There was a riot at the cafeteria when that happened. He said, no alcohol is allowed. Workers snuck off and set up barges and brothels on islands up in the river. But the natural world pushed back as well. Ford refused to bring along many agricultural experts. He didn't like experts, like people like an entomologist, somebody who studied bugs, or plant pathologists who studied plant diseases. Those would have been some useful folks to bring along, but he refused to send them initially, and so a lot of these plants just died. Things might have worked out in Fordlandia, but really the nail in the coffin that ended it was the introduction of synthetic rubber production. When World War II broke out, American manufacturers in particular really accelerated experimentation and production of synthetic rubber and learned how to do it without using natural rubber. So cities like Akron, Ohio ended up becoming major centers of rubber production for the American war machine and for America's post-war obsession with cars. In the end, it might be tempting to see Ford's plan to try to force the Amazonian jungle to his will and to make it into a mini version of Detroit. It's something akin to the Werner Herzog movie Fitzcarraldo, when a rubber baron tries to carry a steamboat across a mountain pass to access great rubber tapping country across the mountains. So in 1945, Henry Ford handed over Fordlandia back to the Brazilian government. He'd spent $20 million trying to build a city in the Amazon. It hadn't worked. Meanwhile, back in New York, after a brief hiatus for World War II because of rubber shortages, the Macy's Parade brought back the flying balloons that spectators loved so much. Because the war was over, they were able to bring back the beloved balloons. So, Ford's dream ends, but America's love of balloons was reinflated all over again. And if you want to learn any more about these things, I encourage you to check out Greg Grandin's excellent book, Fordlandia, where I learned about many of these things. Until then, Dr. Tim out.